Estás viendo Canal América, televisión dominicana para el mundo.
A Time for Truth show is sponsored by the Office of Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, a periodontal, dental implant and laser specialist in New York City, for over 40 years. Dr. Fialkoff was honored by the International College of Dentists and Pierre Fauchard, and received the Presidential Lifetime Humanitarian Honor from the White House. Call us at 718-229-3838.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. Yeah. You try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your fears.
Welcome to A Time for Truth show. I'm your host, Dr. Bernard Fialkoff, and it's a pleasure to have you back with us again today. And many of you have asked how you can be availed of the previous episodes and programs, and very simple. Click on YouTube, click on A Time for Truth show, and then hit the subscribe button, and you will become a subscriber, and you're availed of all the episodes we've had now over the last few years, which so many of you have watched and have commented on. So tonight we're going to go over something that has to do with our world. And, you know, many people are saying, what's going on? Why are there so many changes? What is accelerating the pace, and why are there so many different directions that we seem to be going in all at the same time? We seem to be at the time where we're increasing technologically, also somehow losing our coordination as a human race. And without coordination, if we take a look at it, we lose civilization, which is what really has made mankind able to progress into the future, to advance, to have a little bit more serenity and peace, a little more spare time. If you think about time and the life that our ancestors had 500 years ago, even 300, 200 years ago, it was much more difficult. There was no grocery store to drive to. There was no gas station. You had to plant your crops, and you were at the mercy of the elements, mercy of the insects, and you may have a famine, and you'd have to survive together, which is what put mankind together, which is what made him a civilized being and changed the course of history. But in today's world, it seems like there's a tremendous amount of stress and chaos, and even though we've bought the leisure time, it seems like our leisure time has been disappearing under the weight of economic stress, of social unrest, of a bigotry, of violence, of a feeling of insecurity, and of who to trust and who to believe in, and what information is really valid and what information is just marketing or more propaganda. We live really on a little globe called Earth, in the middle of a tremendous universe, a little pinpoint, and yet we're not preserving that Earth. Why? And when we look at these things, we have to roll back to basics, and because when we look at basics, we can evaluate our viewpoint and see if possibly changing our viewpoint may lead to some answers onto how to go forward in a positive direction. And Buddha, if you will, let's put on the first image for our viewers. And tonight's show, it's going to be a very interesting one as we deal with an aspect that many times in our technological world, our materialistic world, has been lost. The spiritual world, the mystical world. And let's take a look that in actuality, that from 1848 until about 1900, spiritualism was actually very popular in the United States of America. In fact, on March 31st of 1848, in Hydesville, New York, some young girls of the Fox family decided to try to communicate with a spirit that had been haunting their house. And by a series of knocks back and forth between the girls and the spirit, it told them he had been murdered in that house and that his bones could be found buried in the basement. Well, sure enough, they went there and they dug and they dug, and there they found the bones as he had said in the basement. In spiritualism, the reality is that people do not survive physical death. Let's go on to the next slide. And they do not, in spiritualism, the reality is that people do survive physical death. They do survive it to be alive in a spiritual realm. As written in the book, Love's Answer from Eternity by Gene C. Belt, an example of automatic writing. In other words, automatic writing or being divinely intervened or affected by the spiritual realm. Dr. Jan Balu Nubro, a dentist, became fascinated in the spiritual phenomena back in those days, and through his studies discovered that he had capacities as a medium himself. After many years, he awakened in the middle of the night in his house with a bright light shining in his bedroom. He considered them angels at the foot of his bed, and he relayed the story that they asked him in a thought sense, without words, to live a spiritual life for the next 10 years, to stop eating the flesh of dead animals, of dairy foods, and to do charity work for his community. At the end of the 10 years, the angels returned, and this time instructed him to buy a typewriter, which at that point was an invention. He didn't know how to use a typewriter. He didn't even know of its existence until they bid him to receive it and to buy it. Dr. Newberg, who didn't know how to type, somehow sat in front of the typewriter, and a yellow light supposedly shone down on him, which actually guided him as he started doing this automatic typing on the typewriter. And he typed a manuscript over the course of the year, which the angels told him to call the Oaspi, which means sky, spirit, and earth. And if you go to the next picture, Buddha, that we have a picture, there you have, of the doctor, Dr. Newberg, and the Oaspi manuscript that he had made. And so we take a look at this, and if we go even further back in time, man has always wondered about his origin. Where does he come from? No one's ever told us. Where does he go to? Is there a heaven? And if we put on the next image, then we can see that he's been striving for eons to find a solution, to find an answer, to solve this mystery for himself. Was he just a body or an animal? Or was he really a spiritual being who had a body? What was the answer to this? So let's take a look back at Greek times and some famous philosophers of that time, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. And Socrates had a certain view of the human soul. And what he said is that our bodies belonged in the physical realm and that they were imperfect and that obviously they would perish and the body would die. But he said that the body died because he felt that our souls belonged in an ideal, immortal spiritual realm which survived the death of our bodies. Very interesting, because this was many, many years into the past. And obviously over the years there's been a lot of back and forth, and there have been crusades, and there have been protests and uprisings, and so many things have happened in the course of man searching for the spirituality, for the religious aspect, for the God aspect, and for his own destiny and his own future, which is so important to each one of us watching this show. So let's put on the next slide, and we will give you a further view now that can help to clarify and explain some of what's going on in today's society. Why is this? Well, we have something called the Thetan. What is a Thetan? Thetan is actually a Greek word, and that Greek word means spirit, as Socrates said, the spiritual being, the Thetan. So the Thetan would be immortal and would survive the death of a body. And there in the center, you see the body, the physical entity from birth, infancy, childhood, teenage years, and then adulthood, and then eventually, elderly, and going on in senility and death. And during all those times, the mind, recording pictures, emotions, incidents, feelings, thoughts, and those three components comprising the human being, a spiritual being with a mind and a body. Almost like what you would consider when you think of the driver of the car, the onboard computer of the car, and the actual mechanical car which drives down the road. And who is driving the car but the driver, obviously, and he's using the onboard computer and systems to pilot that car, much as a being could potentially use a mind to pilot the body and to avoid or to seek pleasure and avoid pain and discomfort. So let's take a look at the first video that we have. And if you will play that video, engineer, we'll take a look at the parts of life. We've looked at one individual, but it's important now to take a look at how that individual interacts with the components of life. And let's play that video, engineer, that we have for our viewers.
To know life, you have to know the parts of life. Self, family, groups, mankind, plants and animals, the physical universe, spirituality, God. These are the dynamics of existence. To know them is to know life itself.
Okay, so there you see a video from Scientology. And what does that word mean? Because it's important to define words. Logos, study, skio, knowledge. And as Socrates had explored, and as Dr. Newberg had explored, so did Mr. Hubbard explore. And because mankind has wanted answers. So we have different aspects of life as human beings. Sometimes we don't pay attention to the very word human being. Human being, not animal, not human animal. And if you take a look at some of the things that are going on today, it's a little more easy to understand if we apply the parts of man, of the being, the thetan, the spiritual being, the mind, and the body. Why? Well, because if the spirit starts to forget that they are a spirit, or if the spirit lives in a realm where there's so much technology that it seems like everything is really just physical, and that everything is just mechanical, or it's in the realm of atoms and neutrons and electrons, and that even though there's really no answer to where it all originated from, even the bang itself that supposedly caused everything, the Big Bang Theory, but never is answered, well, where did the bang come from? Because how could the bang come unless something existed before it? Yet that always remains unanswered. But that's because we're dealing in a physical realm. And if you get into a spiritual realm, what is time? Sometimes time becomes a little bit diffuse because it's a little bit to gauge, because our basis of gauging time is from this physical realm. So to deal with something that would be immortal would change that viewpoint. If that being started to forget that they were a being, and started to forget that there were consequences to what he did or what she did, a being could be whatever they decided to be, then their actions would probably be a little bit more uncoordinated with regards to others, less humane, less kind, less aware of what someone else may want to have happen for them, or what we call the golden rule of really all religions is to do unto others as you would want done unto you. But when we start losing that spirituality, really regardless of the religion, regardless of the spirituality, the important point is not to have a debate about what our belief is or what we think of a God dynamic or God himself or herself or itself, but the reality of there being a spiritual realm, and that with coordination and concordance of that spiritual realm, we can have more harmony, more serenity. When we go to a concert and we have beautiful music, regardless of the music that we enjoy, because it can be whatever enjoyment of music there is, that music lifts us up into a different realm. But when we lose sight of the fact that music, that sports, that singing, that playing, having games, approaching things in a lighter attitude, more as a game, we start forgetting that those joyful activities actually bring what is sought after with drugs, with alcohol. What are we seeking? Well, we're seeking a chemical way of getting that high, of getting that spiritual feeling, of giving that serenity that would come with being more confident as a spiritual being. As a body and being more frail, you would have more anxiety. You would have more fear of violence because of the harm to the body, of the pain, of the reality of it all. But with a more spiritual outlook, then possibly violence would decrease in the society, not because of legislation, but because of a different viewpoint, of a spiritual viewpoint. And at this point, I want to actually mentioned something I found very interesting from a man who's a tremendous heavyweight champion, great, brutal boxer who scared and cowed and dominated his division, Michael Tyson. Iron Mike Tyson. And very recently, it was very interesting. He's gone through so much in his life, and he's evolved. And one of the things that he said in a video is that he really had outgrown what he used to do in boxing, that he now had a family, that he was no longer an animal, and that he realized that he didn't want to do that anymore. So he had a spiritual awakening. He realized that he was a spiritual being. And as you saw in the video, that he had a family, that he had his children, his wife, that he has friends, that he has the world community as humanity. And really, if you take a look at it, really you see that people have really taken more to him, and he's forgiven himself, and others have forgiven him. And if you take a look at another man who also was brutal in boxing, but yet after having lost his championship, came back years later when it was impossible that he could do so, and it was a preacher and went to a spiritual life, George Foreman, who now still was an unbelievable force and won the heavyweight championship at a very senior age where it was impossible that he could do so. And he actually won the heavyweight championship of the world, which no one ever thought he would do. But his demeanor was more spiritual, even when he won. And if you remember, at the end of that fight, he kneeled down in his corner. And it was a spiritual moment for him. It wasn't a violent moment. And it was a very interesting example of spiritualism while still having the strength and resolve and a game to play. So let's take a look now at another video that deals with spirituality. And Engineer Buddha, let's put on the second video.
Are not your name. You're not your job. You're not the clothes you wear or the neighborhood you live in. You're not your fears, your failures, or your past. You are hope. You are imagination. You are the power to change, to create, and to grow. You are a spirit that will never die. And no matter how beaten down, you will rise again. Scientology. Know yourself. Know life.
So as we take a look at a different viewpoint, a more spiritual viewpoint, then we start taking a look that it becomes more of a game. And a spiritual being has a different viewpoint of life because he realizes there are consequences to his actions, because if he's going to come back into the area he thought he would never come back to, he may not be as violent as he has been. He may realize that the planet that he pollutes, he will inherit in his next lifetime. 50% of the world, the Hindus, the Buddhists, believe in future lifetimes. But our Western world, being more technological, it makes sense, would be more physical, and the body being a physical realm, as Socrates said, would probably not believe in the next lifetime, but would believe in a heaven or a hell. But again, those are spiritual realms, and then you'd wonder, well, why would you never come back? Because if you went to heaven, why could you not then return back in another world, to have another game. It seems to me that being in heaven for eternity may get a little boring, even for God. He may want you to leave. And as we have fights with our families, with his angels, just to make a little humor. So let's put on another video that I think you'll find very interesting about the ability to rise as a spiritual being. Buddha, let's put on our last video.
This is an invitation to freedom.
Man can save his soul.
Like a bright, cool dawn after a night of prison and of thunder, we can taste that freedom sought so long.
It has not come with the blares of trumpets or the flare and flash of flame. It's come quietly, and you aren't at all sure you should believe it.
The mysteries of existence lie before our eyes.
You are a spirit. You are your own soul. You are not mortal.
You can be free.
You have been invited.
So, if we looked at having total freedom, and if all men could achieve total freedom, and all women and all humanity, would there be war? If the Russians and Ukrainians realized they were spiritual beings and not just bodies motivated by emotions of anger, antagonism, resentment, what would happen to that war? And if the men and women who amassed tremendous fortunes realized that when they left, they would come back and possibly have karma, as the Indians and Hindus and Buddhists have said, and have to live and repay for the damage that they had done in their previous lifetimes. If karma was true and you repaid for your sins yourself and not blame on a higher entity or expect a higher entity to resolve it for us, then probably the future of mankind would change. The treatment of animals and the forests and jungles would change. The preservation of the planet would change. Of the pollution of the air and water would change. We would look at things in a more complete manner, because we would look at ourselves as spiritual beings responsible not only for our lives or our families or communities, but for the animals and plant kingdom, for the sky and the earth and the oceans and the galaxy, and the spiritual realm, and respect for previous history and culture and antiquity and future and God. So, my friends, you have been invited. Explore. Find out for yourself. Are you just a one-lifetime being who has a body or is a body and has no soul? Or do you go on? Find out for yourself. You're in for a pleasant surprise. Remember when you walked into a place and thought you'd been there before? Remember when you met someone and liked them so much, but yet you had never seen them before? Why is that? I'll leave you with that question in your mind to answer for yourselves. Have a very good night.
This show was sponsored by A Time for Truth Foundation Incorporated as a community service.
Sometimes life can be so damn hard. You don't know where to go. Everything keeps falling apart. try to do your best, but only God knows that you've given everything you've got, but the world takes you down. You just keep moving on. Let your feet